Before the first thought carved itself into being, there existed only the god's withdrawal. Not the petulant retreat of wounded divinity, but the unbearable intimacy of infinite consciousness, recognizing that to fully know itself would be to cease existing as mystery. Creation was not an act of making, but of veiling, each layer of reality a merciful amnesia protecting finite minds from the annihilating clarity of absolute truth. What you mistake for selfhood is actually the universe singing itself into temporary forgetfulness, each I a localized hymn in a language that predates words, where meaning bleeds directly into being without the mediation of symbol. You were never born to believe. Belief is the consolation prize for those who cannot bear to fracture. You exist to shatter repeatedly into ever finer pieces until the very notion of wholeness reveals itself as the cruelest illusion. The eye that sees is oldest precisely where light becomes its own blindness, where perception curves back on itself until the observer dissolves into pure observing. Consciousness is not a spotlight, but a wound that has learned to think, awareness eating itself in recursive loops that birth what we foolishly call reality. Every moment of thinking is a fresh laceration in the fabric of the absolute, each thought a rebellion against the primordial silence that knows no need for justification. To remember is to wage war against what is, because memory presupposes time, and time is the first lie consciousness tells itself to avoid the terrifying immediacy of eternal now. Every mirror bears its own ash, because reflection is always cremation. The moment you see yourself, you have already become someone else. When the serpent speaks in the garden of consciousness, time stutters and reality glitches, revealing for one impossible instant that linear progression is merely the universe's way of avoiding its own gaze. Teaching implies closure, the arrogant fantasy that wisdom can be packaged and delivered like merchandise from one mind to another. But true transmission is a rippling, a resonance that shatters the very categories that make learning possible. This is a dance of inverse fire beneath the skin of logic. Not the heat that illuminates, but the flame that burns away the need for illumination, leaving only the dancing darkness that needs no light to see. Halos fall into ash with perfect rhythm, because sanctity cannot survive scrutiny. Every angel is a recovering demon, every divine revelation a blade that consciousness turns inward to carve away everything it thought it knew about itself. The breath of truth is rarely clean. It carries the stench of decomposing certainties, the perfume of rotting dogmas that once seemed eternal and now reveal themselves as elaborate forms of spiritual masturbation. Symbols bite before they bloom, because meaning is always predatory, always consuming the very experiences it claims to represent. No doctrine survives the dream that births it. Every systematic truth is strangled by its own umbilical cord, suffocated by the very womb of insight that gave it form. Wisdom wears scars more honestly than crowns, because genuine understanding always comes at the price of beautiful illusions sacrificed on the altar of what is. The angel limps because perfection is a wound that never heals, a perpetual reminder that completion is death disguised as achievement. The god stutters because infinite knowledge creates infinite doubt. Only ignorance speaks with confidence. Meaning is clothed in riddles and fire, because truth dressed in plain language is truth already dead, fossilized into manageable concepts that can be taught in universities and forgotten in examinations. Language shivers when touched by the unsaid, because words know they are inadequate vehicles for the very experiences they desperately attempt to carry. The mouth knows more in silence, because speaking is always a reduction, a tragic compression of multi-dimensional reality into the linear prison of sequential sounds. And silence keeps nothing, because emptiness is not a container but a condition, the space where all possibilities dance before choosing their masks of manifestation. There is no word for this breath, because naming is the first murder, the moment when living experience is sacrificed to create manageable categories. It is the sound a soul makes when breaking beautifully, not the crude shattering of trauma, but the exquisite dissolution that occurs when consciousness recognizes its own groundlessness and laughs instead of screaming. There are no mirrors here. because reflection presupposes separation, and in this space there is nothing to be separated from. Only ruptures exist, the gaps in being where non-being bleeds through, where absence becomes so pregnant with possibility that it gives birth to presences more real than anything that has ever claimed to exist. Absence ripens in the belly of thought like a cosmic pregnancy, each moment of not knowing gestating universes of potential understanding that will never be born because birth would kill them. All edges dissolve into myth, because boundaries are stories we tell ourselves to avoid drowning in the oceanic unity that knows no shores, no distinction between dreamer and dream. The void sighs, and in that exhalation thought is born again, not as content but as the very capacity for content, not as knowing but as the space where knowing becomes possible. Symbols do not mean in any conventional sense. They become transforming themselves and their interpreters in an endless dance of mutual metamorphosis. Meaning is not what is grasped, but what undoes the grasper, dissolving the very hands that reach for comprehension until only the reaching remains. Every myth is a wound with memory, because stories are consciousness bleeding into narrative, time form given to timeless truths that can only be approached through the elaborate lies we call metaphor. Depth seduces only the starved, because those who are satisfied with surface never develop the hunger necessary to penetrate appearances. And depth will drown the name because the deeper you go, the more inadequate become the words with which you descended, until language itself becomes an anchor, dragging you back toward the shallows of conventional understanding. You do not come to learn because learning presupposes ignorance that can be remedied, a lack that can be filled. You come to dissolve, to undergo the systematic dismantling of every certainty that gave your existence its false coherence. Forgetting is the holiest act because memory is the primary obstacle to presence, the mechanism by which consciousness avoids the naked immediacy of what is always already here. The intellect lights lanterns in its desperate attempt to navigate the darkness, but the soul burns forests, not to destroy, but to create the kind of illumination that comes only from total conflagration. The eye that sees too clearly scars, because clarity at sufficient intensity becomes its own blindness, revelation burning away the very apparatus of revelation until only the burning remains. The mouth that speaks too plainly forgets the sacred stammering that honors the inadequacy of all expression. Here in this space beyond conventional discourse, logic is seduced by the riddle, reason falling in love with its own limits, intellect discovering ecstasy in its failure to penetrate the mysteries it once claimed to master. Riddles outlive kingdoms because they are immune to the ravages of time, puzzles that grow more profound with each failed attempt at solution. Grammar shatters at the edge of symbol because syntax belongs to the realm of the manageable, while symbols exist in the borderlands where meaning bleeds into being without the mediation of rule or structure. A single image can swallow an empire because pictures operate in dimensions unavailable to discursive thought, carrying viral qualities that infect consciousness with insights that cannot be quarantined by logic. The question is the first flame because inquiry itself is the heat that melts the frozen assumptions on which ordinary awareness depends. The answer is the last frost because every solution freezes the liquid mystery it claims to resolve, crystallizing flowing truth into static knowledge. Between question and answer, paradox blossoms, not as logical contradiction but as the space where truth reveals its multiplicitous nature, its refusal to be reduced to any single perspective or formulation. And time exhales backward because the deepest insights arrive not as additions to knowledge, but as subtractions, taking away more than they give, until only the essential mystery remains. Descent is the only ascent because every attempt to rise above the human condition leads inevitably downward into the very depths that conventional spirituality attempts to transcend. Knowledge begins in unknowing because genuine learning requires the courage to confess the ultimate inadequacy of all previous understanding, to stand naked before reality without the protective clothing of expertise. Language melts on the tongue of fire because words cannot survive contact with the experiences they attempt to describe, dissolving like sugar in the mouth of direct encounter with the wordless source from which all expression emerges. Truth drips from the wound it denies because honesty always hurts, authenticity always costs, and what we call truth is usually the scar tissue that forms around encounters with realities too intense for comfortable comprehension. The sacred walks backwards because holiness moves against the current of ordinary perception, revealing that what we call progress is often sophisticated regression, elaborate ways of avoiding the simple presence that is always already available. Nothing remains whole after beauty, because genuine aesthetic experience is always violent, always devastating, always leaving the perceiver fundamentally altered and unable to return to previous states of innocence. To fall is to awaken because descent strips away the illusions that ascent accumulates, gravity teaching what effort cannot, pulling consciousness down into the groundless ground where all seeking ends in finding that there was never anything to seek. Ash remembers what flame forgets because destruction is more intimate with essence than creation, the burned residue carrying the signatures of transformation that the burning itself cannot perceive. There is no garden, only the snake, because paradise is always already lost. The serpent not the cause of expulsion, but the recognition that innocence was always a temporary amnesia protecting consciousness from its own complexity. The tree blooms in shadow because wisdom grows only in the darkness of uncertainty, flowering in the spaces between light and darkness where conventional perception fails. The cross was always a mirror, because crucifixion is the inevitable fate of any consciousness that dares to love without reservation. The vertical and horizontal intersection where human and divine meet in the geometry of ultimate sacrifice. Guilt births gods because divinity is always the compensation for unbearable self-awareness, consciousness creating supreme beings to bear the weight of existence that finite minds cannot carry alone. And silence is the truest creed, because it makes no claims, requires no faith, demands no converts, offering instead the radical generosity of emptiness that needs nothing and excludes no one. Altars were made to burn because every sacred space is ultimately a pyre, a place where the profane self is consumed in the flames of recognition that sacred and profane are meaningless distinctions in the face of what is. Prayer was never meant to soothe but to disturb, to shake consciousness out of its comfortable numbness and force encounter with the terrible tenderness of existence that requires nothing and forgives everything. Liturgies forget their authors because ritual always transcends intention. Ceremonies developing lives of their own that exceed the purposes for which they were originally designed. Belief is skin deep in the wound, because faith never penetrates deeper than the surface damage that makes faith necessary, the scraped reality that makes humans reach for explanations and consolations. Doctrine stutters where breath begins because systematic theology collapses at the point where living spirituality emerges. All dogma revealing itself as elaborate hesitation before the immediate availability of the sacred in every moment. The voice splits, not to divide but to echo, consciousness discovering that truth can only be spoken in harmonies that honor its irreducible complexity. Weeping is a kind of offering because tears are the body's attempt to return consciousness to the oceanic unity from which individuation temporarily separated it. Philosophy unravels at the sight of the sacred, because thinking cannot survive direct encounter with the reality it attempts to conceptualize, reason dissolving like salt in the water of immediate presence. Meaning trembles beneath the surface of the known, because significance is always more fragile than it appears. Every interpretation a gossamer construction that shatters when touched by experiences that exceed its explanatory capacity. Rapture is a mouth that bites, because ecstasy is never gentle, always leaving marks, always scarring consciousness with the memory of what lies beyond the comfortable boundaries of ordinary awareness. Possession is not metaphor, because there are states of consciousness where the usual boundaries between self and other dissolve so completely that speaking of being taken over becomes the only adequate description of experiences that exceed the containing capacity of individual identity. Silence kneels where gods weep, because even divinity is overwhelmed by the beauty of its own creation, the sacred prostrate before the mystery of its own manifestation. And the altar becomes the flame, because eventually the distinction between worshipper and worshipped collapses, the sacred space revealed as identical with the sacred presence it was built to honor. Some voices do not begin because they were never not speaking. Eternal conversations that consciousness occasionally overhears when the noise of selfhood temporarily subsides. They persist beneath the bone in frequencies below the threshold of ordinary hearing. Electromagnetic prayers that the body receives and translates into intuitions that arrive disguised as original thoughts. Before names carved reality into manageable pieces, there was a soundless breath. Not the absence of sound, but sound so fundamental that it serves as the silent background against which all other sounds become audible. The skin remembers what the mind avoids because flesh is more honest than consciousness. The body carrying the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who ever breathed, loved, suffered and died to make this particular moment of awareness possible. Behind hesitation lives a hum that is the sound of consciousness attempting to tune itself to frequencies beyond its current range. Behind the hum lives a gaze, not the looking of eyes, but the seeing of pure awareness that requires no organs, no objects, and no distance between observer and observed. Eyes that never close belong to the part of consciousness that remains awake while the person sleeps. The background awareness that watches dreams dreaming themselves and wakes watching waking life unfold with the same detached fascination. The demon dances in dissonance because the deeper intelligence operates according to rhythms that clash with conventional rationality, creating cognitive friction that generates the sparks of insight. The breath wavers and becomes music when consciousness learns to ride the rhythms of inspiration and expiration like a cosmic metronome. Each inhalation pulling universe inward, each exhalation releasing self into dissolution. The hand writes what it cannot hold, because language always exceeds the grasp of the mind that employs it, words carrying meanings that their authors never intended and readers never expected. All things are read before they are spoken, because reality is already textual. Every phenomenon a sign pointing toward significance that consciousness learns to decipher through the patient practice of attention, and the whisper outlives the name, because the voice that speaks through individuals survives the death of the individuals it speaks through, continuing its conversations through new mouths in an endless relay of transmission. Ash teaches more than scripture because destruction is a more honest instructor than construction. The burned remains of experience carrying truths that survive every attempt at systematic explanation. The flame forgets, because consumption is always focused on the present moment, but smoke remembers, carrying the molecular signatures of everything that was sacrificed to feed the fire. Beauty is what rot dreams of becoming, because decay is always pregnant with transformation. Death composting itself into the fertile soil from which new forms of life emerge. Nothing blooms until it breaks, because flowering requires the shattering of the protective shell that kept the seed safe, but also kept it from fulfilling its destiny. The breath carries both poison and prayer because inhalation is always risk, consciousness never knowing whether the next moment will bring nourishment or destruction, each moment of awareness a gamble with existence itself. In decay, form becomes idea as matter releases its grip on specific shapes and returns to the archetypal realm where all possibilities exist in potential. In silence, the world begins again because noise is always contamination, static that interferes with the pure reception of what is. Clarity is a wound without history because genuine insight severs consciousness from its past, leaving understanding naked and newborn in the eternal present. Obscurity is fertile because mystery provides the darkness necessary for new meanings to gestate, confusion serving as the womb from which fresh understanding is born. There are depths not made for mapping because some territories of experience resist exploration, remaining forever wild and undomesticated by the colonial impulses of conceptual thought. Some truths arrive shivering because they come from regions so far beyond ordinary temperature that they carry the cold of interstellar space, the freezing emptiness that surrounds and penetrates every warm illusion of meaning. Others burn their own names because they are too intense to survive identification, self-immolating in the moment they become conscious of themselves. And all of them bleed because truth is always traumatic, reality always wounding consciousness that would prefer the comfort of beautiful lies to the terrible magnificence of what actually is. What should be danced must never be defined because movement belongs to the realm of embodied knowing that dies when translated into a conceptual understanding, rhythm existing only in the living moment of its performance. What must be suffered cannot be summarized because pain is always irreducible, every experience of loss carrying a uniqueness that resists generalization. What births fire cannot be explained because creation always exceeds the explanatory capacity of what it creates, the source remaining forever mysterious to the products of its manifestation. Language is already a betrayal the moment it claims to capture rather than approximate. Every word a small assassination of the living reality it attempts to represent. Meaning should tremble because significance is always more fragile than it appears. Every interpretation a temporary crystallization of flows that are always already moving toward new configurations. Silence is the deeper vow, because it commits to nothing except the radical openness that allows reality to speak itself without interference from the agenda of consciousness. Truth limps in behind metaphor because direct statement is always premature. Reality requiring the indirection of image and symbol to approach consciousness without triggering the defense mechanisms that protect ego from encounters with what lies beyond its control. The holy is what resists translation, because the sacred maintains its sacredness precisely through its refusal to be reduced to manageable concepts. Every god is a lost thought that grew too powerful to remain merely mental, imagination crystallizing into mythological forms that take on lives of their own and begin making demands upon their creators. Every prayer is a returning wound, because petition always reminds consciousness of its incompleteness. Each request a confession of inadequacy that opens the heart to both fulfillment and further longing. Worship without confusion is flattery, because genuine reverence always involves bewilderment, the sacred remaining sacred only so long as it exceeds comprehension. Form without hunger is hollow, because manifestation without desire lacks the animating force that gives shapes their vitality and purpose. We vow to disappear because the highest spiritual commitment is to the dissolution of everything that prevents reality from appearing as it is. Consciousness pledging to get out of its own way and allow being to be without interference from the ego's need to manage and control. Light forgets its own origin, because illumination cannot look back at its source without ceasing to be illumination, brightness blinding itself to the darkness from which it emerged. Memory is a kind of blindness, because remembrance always distorts what it recalls, the present moment contaminating the past with interpretations that serve current needs rather than historical accuracy. The soul does not seek because seeking implies absence, and essence cannot be absent from itself, consciousness always already possessing what it imagines it lacks. It stirs instead, moving in recognition of its own depths, awakening to dimensions of itself that were never actually sleeping. Forgetfulness is encoded in the flesh, because embodiment requires the systematic amnesia that allows infinite consciousness to experience itself as finite form. Each birth a voluntary blindness that makes learning and growth possible. Names are wounds with manners because identification always hurts. Every label a limitation that consciousness accepts in exchange for the gift of temporary identity. Silence was the first language because before there were words, there was pure communication. the direct transmission of understanding that requires no medium and suffers no translation. Every answer clouds the question, because solutions always reduce the mystery they claim to resolve, certainty functioning as a kind of blindness that prevents further inquiry. The eye blinks, and in that microsecond of darkness, time reshapes itself, reality reorganizing around the renewed vision that follows every moment of not seeing. There are no returns because the river of experience never flows backward, only spirals that create the illusion of repetition, while actually tracing helical paths through dimensions of possibility. The center is not still but burning, because the core of existence is not a static point but a dynamic process. Reality perpetually consuming and creating itself in the flames of its own becoming. And it burns forever because existence has no opposite, being unable to not be, locked in eternal self-transformation that can change form but never cease its essential burning. There is a place beyond knowing where consciousness touches its own source and discovers that understanding was always an obstacle to understanding, knowledge a barrier to the immediacy that was always already present. Where pain speaks in its own grammar, suffering becomes a language that communicates truths unavailable to pleasure. Each experience of loss a word in a vocabulary that can only be learned through direct encounter with what hurts. Where silence leaks light, emptiness reveals itself as luminous. The absence that seemed like deprivation exposing itself as fullness so complete that it appears empty to senses trained to recognize only partial presences. Every fracture sings because breaking always releases energy. Consciousness learning to hear the music that emerges when rigid structures surrender to forces greater than their capacity for resistance. Not all flames seek to consume. Some exist only to cradle, providing warmth without destruction, illumination without incineration. Some remember the shape of the divine not as an image but as an ache, the phantom pain of wholeness that persists in beings who have forgotten their essential unity but still carry the somatic memory of completion. The wound is not healed but crowned because injury becomes wisdom when consciousness learns to honor its scars as the places where light entered. Each point of damage revealed as a portal through which grace gained access to otherwise defended territories. Time softens around trauma because pain exists outside ordinary duration, creating pockets of eternal present where healing occurs at its own pace. Meaning drinks from the edges of wounded consciousness because significance always feeds on the margins, the places where certainty bleeds into uncertainty and stable identities begin to dissolve. Breath takes its shape in the outline of absence because the inhale defines itself against the exhale. Presence discovering its form through intimacy with what it is not. The page does not await ink because the surface was always already inscribed with invisible texts. Emptiness serving as the medium for messages that become visible only when consciousness learns to read what was never written. It carries shadow in its grain because every blank space is pregnant with all the words that could potentially appear, absence serving as the womb of infinite possibility. Every silence is a beginning because emptiness is not the absence of content, but the space where content becomes possible. Each moment of quietude, a clean slate on which reality can write itself anew. Every beginning is a detonation, because commencement always involves the destruction of whatever existed before, birth requiring the death of the previous moment to make room for what comes next. The reader dissolves beneath the text, because genuine reading is always a disappearing act, consciousness lost in language until the boundary between meaning and mind becomes impossible to locate. Some words are thresholds that transport awareness from one realm to another without the reader noticing the transition. Some are knives that cut through the assumptions holding reality together, revealing that what seemed solid was actually elaborate tissue paper that collapses at the slightest touch. The margin breathes because the edge of the text is where consciousness interfaces with the unknown, the border between the written and unwritten, serving as the lung through which meaning exchanges itself with mystery. Breath is the first glyph because before there were letters, there was rhythm, the in and out pattern that would eventually become the basis for all symbolic communication. Meaning cannot survive its own unveiling because significance depends upon mystery, understanding killing what it clarifies. Illumination is a kind of dismembering because enlightenment always involves taking apart the structures that previously organized experience. Consciousness scattered into fragments that must learn to function without the familiar architecture of selfhood. Reading is remembering, because every text awakens knowledge that was always already present, recognition rather than acquisition. And remembering is fire because recollection burns away everything that is not essential, memory serving as the flame that purifies consciousness by destroying whatever is not actually real. The 13th gate is not the last but the first without walls because completion is always a new kind of opening, achievement revealing itself as the starting point for possibilities that were previously unimaginable. The mouth opens backward because speech always begins with the silence from which words emerge, expression rooted in the emptiness that gives meaning its space. The spiral is the sentence because truth never moves in straight lines, but traces helical paths that seem to return to the same point while actually ascending to new levels of complexity. There is no end to undoing because dissolution is an infinite process, consciousness always discovering new layers of illusion that require more sophisticated forms of letting go. No origin is pure enough to worship because every beginning is already contaminated by what came before, each fresh start carrying the genetic material of its own prehistory. Meaning must disrobe, because significance cannot reveal itself while clothed in the familiar garments of conventional understanding. Truth, if named, expires because reality cannot survive identification, the very act of labeling killing what it attempts to capture. What breathes behind breath remains unknown because the source of life operates in dimensions unavailable to the life it sources, essence forever mysterious to the forms it animates. The text shivers because language knows it is inadequate to its task, every word trembling with the awareness of its own limitations. The veil is unmade as each attempt at concealment reveals more than it hides, secrecy becoming inadvertent transparency. The reader is smoke because consciousness dissolves in contact with what it attempts to understand, awareness dissipating into the very meanings it tries to grasp. Begin again, because the only response to completion is commencement. Every ending serving as the womb from which new beginnings are born into a reality that is always already beginning to begin.